What is more strategic in such a debate where you regret homework is to go ahead and say that the counterfactual is something that would be used by the child itself in far better ways, or the time that that child spends for the homework is something that they're essentially not maximizing the utility out of. So on Gov, a simple counterfactual that could be run instead of running something because opposition is just going to say that this time is rather wasted as a kid, so might as well do something that helps you. On Gov, you can simply say that no, this time is spent with your family, and that's maybe good because of how limited time working parents often have. Or if not family time, the counterfactual can also be that this kid puts this time in learning extracurricular activities. The 2 hours that are assigned to homework every evening now go to maybe a practice, karate, football, cricket, badminton, basketball, whatever, debating. Uh, so in such a motion, there are hundreds of counterfactuals to choose from. If not homework, the kid might be doing hundreds of things. In those instances, it's very important to know what is the most strategic thing to run and what is the thing that will lead you to the path of victory in the most certain way. In this instance, it's showing a world where the kid does not waste that time, but rather spends it on physical activity or extracurricular activity or just family time, things which you can prove to be utile by the end of the debate. That's the third thing that you need to keep in mind. The last thing you need to keep in mind is just to think simple. Oftentimes, our intuition is correct. And the more that we second guess ourselves, the more we end up in the loop of confusion. What do I mean by this? If I am debating the motion which says this house will ban religious schools, and religious schools are schools which involve a heavy part of religious teachings in their curriculum, either as a replacement to traditional curriculum or complementary to traditional curriculum, then what might be reasons to ban religious schools? Um, in such motions, I've seen many Gov teams say that, oh, religious schools radicalize the way that you think. But I think that this is definitely not the most certain thing that you can think in such motions. And that is what I mean when I say think simple. Try to think of instances or premises, which is a word you will hear more often than now, like starting now, premises which cannot be disputed. I think a very simple premise in this argument on Gov, which is extremely difficult to dispute for any opposition, is just to say that if you have religious teaching, your thinking might be more religion oriented. That is the most certain idea that you can derive out of such a motion. You don't need to think of anything. It's just what you see is written on the motion and what you think is obviously going to happen without rushing to the end argument itself. Once you have been able to decide or decipher what exactly is this very simple or basic premise that becomes true by the virtue of the motion, like in this house will ban religious schools, it's just on Gov, you can say people are more oriented or their thinking becomes more oriented with religion. Now that you have decided what premise is true, you start building the argument on that. And oftentimes, these are the most powerful arguments. A very effective argument then Gav just then becomes the fact that, oh, the more that your thinking is oriented by religion, the more that you will find yourself hesitating before you make decisions. Because now decision making is not just clouded by logical, i.e., rational and emotional reasons, it is also clouded by a religious angle. And that just makes decision making a lot tougher. And then you just draw the most simple conclusion of you having a tough time making a decision. Let's place this in the context of colleges, right? The most simple decision or the most simple harm I could see myself accrue because I had to choose between a bunch of engineering colleges is the regret that I have to live with for choosing DTU. Maybe the second backup option that I had would have been a much better option for my personal growth or debating growth or professional growth. So, generally speaking, whenever you are second guessing your decisions and whenever it becomes a lot more complex and complicated for you to come to decisions, you just have a lot more regret of what could have been. And that's the simplest argument in this debate. And it has very little to do with religion, like just aside the fact that you now think in a religiously oriented way. Of course, there are more layers to revolving this argument. You might even debate about the nature of decisions that you now take and you don't take, and things like that. But oftentimes, try to just see what is the most clear and basic thing that now happens as a consequence of the motion itself. And if that is simple enough that it becomes incredibly tough to dispute something like that, then you're on the right track. One last example to make this very clear is if the motion reads, this house supports the privatization of prisons. There might be a lot of things that are true and difficult to dispute from opposition. But there is one thing that is definitely true. If there's an increasing trend of privatization of prisons, there will exist more prisons because private players outnumber the state, which is singular in nature. And combined, private players have more capacity than the state. And that's the easiest thing that is difficult to disprove from opposition, that now we can simply have more jails because privatization means that private players come up in this space. So I think generally try to think of what of course or obviously or very like virtually almost happens as a consequence of the debate, and then try to base your arguments off of that. This is the general idea around comparatives or trade-offs. And the reason it's important is because if you don't compare your arguments with the case that the other side is going to bring, your case then remains in a vacuum and it's very difficult for the judges to evaluate. That's the first idea on generation. What is the second broad idea on generation? It's analysis, because the most annoying and the most frequent and the most confusing piece of feedback that debaters on earth have been known to give and receive is that you lack analysis. What does it simply mean for someone to lack analysis? Because it's so confusing oftentimes when someone says that there was a lack of analysis. The most basic building blocks of any argumentation or anything that can be credited as an argument, or the two steps that you need to focus on when you want to turn an assertion into an argument, are as follows. Why is it true? And why is it important? If the motion is, this house will ban zoos, I think the argument that you can come up with on Gov naturally is that this causes pain to animals because you cage them, remove them from their natural habitats, forcefully displace them from their mothers, things like that. You and a lot of other things that zoos do with animals. If you want to build this argument that zoos hurt animals, the first thing that you do is list down the reasons for why zoos end up hurting animals. And this can be very easily done. But I think there needs to be one thing that you keep in mind. The way that a lot of debaters have been taught to consume and credit arguments is through structural reasons. What this jargon just means is that it's a reason that can be true in the vast majority of instances. It simply means for something to be structurally true, you just need to show that structures around us facilitate something. That's the more technical meaning of it. And the more generally accepted meaning of it is, in the vast majority of instances, why is this explanation true? So, if I want to prove that zoos have hurt animals, the first thing I can talk about is space. Why is it important that animals have space to roam around? Why is it important that animals can move beyond the 16 by 16 cage that they've often been entrapped in and things like that? What is the significance of space to life itself, like living space or whatever it is? There are multiple ways that you can analyze that. The second can be the kind of food that you get. On one hand, in the natural habitat, animals are free to eat what they want whenever they want. On the other hand, it's forceful feeding that's done to you because there's an incentive for zookeepers to then present you in front of everyone at specific stipulated timings because that's how zoos operate. The third thing can just be how zoos abuse animals for just making like humans happy. Maybe organizing shows where dolphins just hop through hoops and things like that. There are a multitude of reasons that you can give for something, but that's not where the idea ends. The more important part of the question of why is it true is bringing that logical reason to a logical end. And that is what I mean by the why loop. Once you ask yourself a reason, or once you answer your own question of why is it true, with every justification or every single line of reasoning that you have come up with, it's incredibly difficult to keep asking yourself why, what, and how. A very simple way of doing this is if my idea is that on this house will ban zoos, if the first idea is just that animals need living space, why do animals need living space? Because their muscles, their stimuli, their brain also gets developed as a function of the experiences that they're able to accumulate. Why is living space so essential to accumulating experiences? Because their brain also operates in the same way that our brain does. And after a point of time, the utility they can derive out of a fixed or a confined space is very limited because they too don't like the fact that their agency is being inhibited upon or things like that. And this while loop can keep going on and on and on until you have reached an end, which is extremely, extremely, extremely easy to consume. So maybe in the motion that says this house supports corporal punishment, if you ask, if the argument out of the thesis is just to say that this disciplines kids, why does this discipline kids? Because the fear of violence makes kids act in line. But why do kids fear violence? Kids fear violence because they feel bad when someone hits them, or someone shouts at them, or someone hurls abuses at them. But why do they feel bad? Because it's being pointed out that they have done something very bad and they're exclusively responsible for causing that harm or outcome. But why is the part of corporal punishment or doing it harshly or forcefully the most important thing here? It's important here because that memory stays with the kid for a long, long time and things like that. When you're able to significantly answer the while loop to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 instances and bring yourself to a very irreducible idea, that's when you know that you have completed the argument. Sadness, happiness, pain, trauma, suffering, all of these are notions that an average reasonable voter understands. You're happy when something good happens. You're sad when something unpleasant happens. Happiness means that you feel good about life and yourself. Sadness means you feel a sense of doom and gloom about things happening around you. When you reduce things to such a basic idea or a basic level, that's when you can rest easy and know that your reasoning or your line of reasoning is now complete or adequate. That is the first broad idea on why things are true. But that's not enough, right? Why? Because in an Asian debate, both sides can come up with multiple arguments that are true. In a British parliamentary debate, four sides can come up with four arguments of their own of why something is true. So what becomes extremely important in debates is to situate your own argument, is to understand what are you doing in the debate and why is it important. So if my idea, and this is where we are slowly segueing into the idea of comparisons as well. So if the motion is this house supports corporal punishment in schools, or this house, like if I'm opting this house supports corporal punishment, my idea would just be that, look, corporal punishment is bad, and you give a multitude of reasons why that's bad. The fear of violence, how this becomes like how this impairs children from taking certain decisions, this reduces self-confidence and self-image and things like that. But the reason this is important, one of the many reasons, of course, is maybe because this leaves a very long term harm on the kid. The kid, even after 20 years, is unable to open up and be confident in their own ideas because as a kid, they were taught that they need to be absolutely correct before they open their mouth. Otherwise, the comparative is having been hit with a scale and things like that. So I think that why is it important generally concerns itself with the question of, okay, what is the consequence of this in the real world? What is the end conclusion that I want to draw? Is the end conclusion that I want to draw happiness and why that happiness manifests itself over a long term? Is the end conclusion that I want to draw sadness and why that sadness manifests itself over the long term and things like that? That's the first idea. Like that's the second broad idea then over why is it important. The third idea is not particularly concerned with generation itself, but it's concerned with how the generation of matter reflects itself in speeches. The third idea is that of note making. Oftentimes, you will after debates, ask yourself and even reflect, saying that, oh, whatever the judge is giving us feedback is something that I definitely thought of in the prep, and we even discussed this. Why was it that the judge then points out the same issues in our team or in our case? I think, and then the idea is very simple. It's just about the notes that you make. And of course, this is not a general rule of thumb because there are multiple things that work for multiple people. I've seen people go into a debate speech with 10 words written on an A4 size sheet of paper and deliver one of the best speeches that I've ever heard. But I've also seen people write word by word, including articles such as the, full stops, apostrophes, everything precisely done end to end, and then only entering the debate speech confidently. The broad idea is that you should have a structure regardless of how much you write in prep about how you want to present ideas. The most obvious question then is what structure? There are two kinds of structures that you need to be very like just clear about. The first structure is the structure that's inherent or innate to any argument in existence of why is this true and why is this important. The second set of things or like components that you need to remember as a part or as a focus on structure is the things that encompass building, and there are three or fourfold deciding on who you ask: framing, characterization, impacting, and weighing. We'll go on this one by one, but before that, I want to just outline why note making is so terribly important. Note making is terribly important because without note making, people often forget doing the first two things on this slide itself. And then if you proceed to the next step, of course, it's going to be muddy considering that you haven't done the initials well. So if people are unclear about the comparative, if people are unclear about what the other world does, if people are unclear about what happens on the other side or what is their idea of reaching the same outcome, then it's incredibly unclear for why your case interacts and how it interacts with the other team. So if the motion is that this house prefers a world where you communicate with the dead, or this house prefers a world where there exists an AI machine which can make us talk to our deceased or like loved ones for X period of years or things like that. In those instances, both sides are going to argue closure. Both sides are going to argue one simple thing of how is closure achieved better. For Gov, the motion very simply and very sharply outlines that. The motion simply says that you achieve closure when, or you can argue that closure is achieved when you can talk to the dead and when you can go ahead and settle all qualms that you had with them. And you can build a whole case on that. Opposition, of course, realizes that this is the meaning or the end goal of the debate, or this is the idea with which the motion was set in the first place. So, opposition's idea of reaching the same end goal is going to be social indicators, social cues, social help, therapy, community, friends, job, linear passage of life, things like that. So if you're unclear about what both sides agree on and what both sides disagree on, if you're unclear about those things, it becomes extremely difficult to then proceed with the debate. Because believe it or not, 95% of debates are just one on this, like these two ideas. A is the comparative clear, that is to say, is your argument only happening on your side and it's not symmetric? Can opposition come and say, well, that happens on our side as well, and your argument is therefore uncomparative? Does that happen? Or are you willing to bite the trade-off, or are you not willing to bite the trade-off? And the second thing just being, do you prove the two basic steps of why is it true and why is it important? Note making, regardless of the style in which it is done, helps concretize these two ideas on a sheet of paper. And if that sheet of paper is in front of you, it becomes really difficult to ignore those steps. And if it becomes difficult for you to ignore those steps, it becomes difficult for you to lose. That's as simple as that. Building. Before that, are there any questions on the generation part? Yeah, of course.
So
You
like,
can unmute.
can you once again tell about the trade-off part in particularly? Like, comparative is mostly about like agreeing or disagreeing and what side is presenting what, and like knowing about that. Uh, how the trade-off works then? So
Cool. Hmm. Let's take a very uh, let's take a contextual example that all of us can relate to. Then, this house uh, believes that DTU or Gargi should expand the number of seats that it has. Of course, this expansion can be anything. Maybe they expand it by 100%, 75%, 200%, whatever. The debate is just about expansion of seats. The argument in favor of it can be, these institutions are great. These institutions provide quality education, and these institutions shouldn't lock out access for that quality education from kids who are deserving and who are hardworking and who should be able to attain that education. That's why you should increase seats. On Gov, it's just about access. So Gov's prioritization of the debate is, we prioritize the number of people who get education because of how important education as a tool of social mobility is. That's Gov. Opposition is going to argue that, look, DTO and Gargi are great institutions. And if you want status quo to remain that way, if you want quality education to still exist, if you want the top minds of your country to still flock to these colleges and apply for courses, if you want the student teacher ratio to remain something that is manageable and not something that is unmanageable, if you want the infrastructure to be adequate for these kinds of people, like this amount of people, and not feel suffocated, that's all the more reason that you don't expand. That is to say, when you don't expand, at least you give 100 people quality education. But when you expand it to 200 seats, everyone receives a substandard quality of education in every aspect of the word. And that's opposition's broad goal in the debate. They want to preserve quality. Now the trade off becomes clear. On Gov, you'll have to forego quality because resources are finite. Resources do not commensurately increase with an increase in the number of seats because of a lot of reasons. There is political stagnancy. Resources are just zero sum. DU might have a fixed budget that it needs to allocate. DTU might have a fixed budget that it needs to allocate, and things like that. Similarly, on opposition, it's quite clear that they cannot argue access because they don't want to expand the number of people. Hence, they want to leave a large portion of kids without educational facilities and things like that. This is a clear example of a trade off. And this is a scenario where teams need to tell us why their end goal matters more than the end goal of the other side. A very brief way of doing this from Gov is just to talk about the importance of education as a social mobility tool and why nothing can ever socially mobilize or like allow social mobility to the same way that education does. Nothing in the world can uplift people out of poverty and like just employ millions of people like education enables them to do. Similarly, on opposition, they can claim that, cool, if this social mobility is what your end goal is, if going ahead and allowing people to aspire and achieve a better quality of life is what you want, then these people need to get the best standard of that education. They need to actually understand what their curriculum entails. They need to be able to take the best and maximize the use of the infrastructure that their campuses provide them. And that's why this mechanism or this way of preserving quality is a better way of achieving that social mobility. These are some ways or these are some instances where you see that both sides would want to benefit people, benefit humanity, and might even have the same goal of social mobility. But one side wants to do it by providing more access, while other side wants to do it by providing quality access. Another very clear example of this, of trade-offs, is the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system, one can argue, has multiple goals. The first goal that the criminal justice system has to rehabilitate the criminal, because we all know how that argument goes, that the criminal is a function of the inadequacy of the state. The criminal became a criminal because their area had very little educational opportunities. Their area had very little factories employing unskilled workers. Their area had very little security personnel guarding the streets at night, and hence created a conducive environment for that individual to turn to crime and for that individual to normalize crime in their heads. And that's why the CJS owes an obligation to the criminal. The second idea is that, oh, well, the CJS exists for the victims, right? Because if one of us has been wronged, there has to be an institution in place which maintains and delivers justice. Because otherwise, the society will turn into an anarchy where people seek justice as they deem fit, use the necessary means that they deem fit, and do whatever they want without being accountable or answerable to anyone. A third school of thought can just be that, look, it's just to keep people safe. Sure, it might be about some victims. Sure, it might be about some criminals. But at large, it's to just keep society safe. It's to keep the money printer running. It's to keep like homes going. It's to keep institutions safe, corporations doing whatever they want, just to maintain a general sense of law and order in society, even if there aren't many victims and things like that. This is another instance of where teams might have to argue about the trade-off. And in this like similar debate, like this house believes that AI should replace human judges, Gov can argue efficiency, and Gov can back their argument up by arguing how much backload is or how much like load there is on the criminal justice system in India. An opposition can just say that the fairness of justice itself is tainted. So what good is efficiency then? And then these two goals of the criminal justice are compared. Gov's whole case is justice delayed is justice denied. So we need to give more people justice. And that's their mechanism of upholding justice. It's speed and efficiency. Opposition's metric of upholding justice is the quality or the fairness or the nature of that justice itself. And that's how it wants to help people. Similarly, a very famous, like, and I'll stop after this, I promise. I'll move to the next part. It's how do you want to benefit human life? A very common debate is about, do you want to give more, like just a debate about like K-pop stars. It's a very famous debate, and there's a very famous recorded round also on YouTube. It's one of my favorite debate rounds ever. 2021 Korea World Semis. It's just about like, would you as an average Korean prefer to be born as a K-pop star or prefer to live the life of a K-pop star? One side argues money, fame, and all the good things in life that you can imagine. All the material aspects of the person's lives taken care of. And the other side simply argues agency and says that nothing in life is meaningful if I have absolutely no control over how those material aspects shape my life. If I have no control over what I eat, if I can't eat from the best Korean restaurant in the world, there is very little utility for the money. If I can't date who I want because we need to maintain a certain image as a K-pop, I don't know, like outlet or a brand, then there's very little utility in that fame and in that social capital. If I can't spend time the way that I want, then there is very little utility in having those material aspects fulfilled because I'm just not happy with those constraints. And then these two goals are compared, money versus agency. So these are some classic examples of where you find yourself at a crossroad and where you find yourself evaluating a trade off. Yeah, is there a follow up on that?
Yeah, it's clear now.
Okay, okay. I see another hand. Yeah, you can unmute.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question on trade-off also. How to like identify the potential harm a trade-off can do to your case? That is, if I, in the middle of case, when I listen to the side opposition speech, and I realize that this certain thing needs to be traded off, how to assess whether this trade-off is actually beneficial for a case or it will do more harm than good in mitigating my own benefits?
Fair enough. I think a couple of things just to keep in mind in these instances. Opposition, of course, is going to bring an array of harms onto you. Now, there are two things that, like, there is just one thing actually. One thing that you should look out for. Is this harm exclusive to their side, or is this harm not exclusive to their side? Are what they talking about actually a harm or not? So, like, if I say in a debate which says, um, this house would break up Amazon, there are 100 harms that I can think of. Let's think of 2, 3 harms, and then let's understand the question better. I think one harm is that Amazon has the ability to massively subsidize products because of how huge it is. So it can move surplus from one place to the other, and hence it can give us deep Diwali and Holi discounts. That's one harm. The second harm of breaking up Amazon can simply be, oh, you know what? It's really going to take up a lot of time because of how big Amazon is. And it's really going to be a difficult judicial legal process. Just imagine the amount of paper that's going to be wasted. Imagine the amount of filings that it will take. Imagine the amount of declarations that every individual will have to sign. Oh, the second harm that I'm going to present from Gav is that it's massive wastage of paper. The third harm that I can think of, and of why you shouldn't break up Amazon, is this will disrupt innovation. Because if they have so much money, they can innovate, research, develop more. I think one harm clearly out of these three is not a harm. And I think everyone recognizes it. Paper being used is not a harm. I think you can just say, the easiest response on OP is to say, digital signatures exist. Everything is going to be digitized. In this instance, what you have done is you have not taken the trade-off and you have just said that this harm is symmetric. So that's the first answer to the question. If there are ways to prove that the harm is symmetric, then that's not a trade off that you should take, because trade offs also need to be taken cleverly. Otherwise, it will be a problem that you find yourself in. The second thing is then evaluating the remaining harms. The first harm was of consumers no longer getting deep discounts. And the second harm was of competition. If I am on opposition, there are two strategies that I can take. A, three strategies. Yeah. A is to bite both trade offs and say, look, I'm going to do two things now. A, tell you why the extent of harm of the extent of Gov's proposed harms is minimum and why our benefit is more in extent. And second, just responses telling you why Gov's harm is not that big of a harm. The second option is to bite one trade-off and do the same set of steps. And the third option is to bite zero trade-offs and try to prove everything symmetric. I think the third option is out because it's just difficult to prove these things to be symmetric. Then it's just about how you choose to engage with these harms. In my opinion, it's more difficult to prove deep discounts or consumer side benefit as symmetric. I think a better strategy is to just say that, look, you want to break up, like a better strategy to just say, or like, is to just argue like whatever opposition has of why you shouldn't break up Amazon, like whatever reasons that exist. I also realize that these two arguments are from opposite sides. I'm sorry about that. So let's just like then go back to the first argument for the sake of clarity. The first argument is there are massive discounts that people will no longer be able to avail. That's why you shouldn't break up Amazon. And the second reason why you shouldn't break up Amazon is innovation. These are reasons for not breaking up Amazon. I think, in my head at least, I think it's easier to prove that competition or innovation more or less is not that different on both sides. So it's something that I will try to respond heavily on. I will talk about competition. I will talk about numerous small firms and why so many small firms competing with each other means that everyone will have to find a different way of entering the market. I will talk about state subsidies. State has an incentive for competition to keep continuing. State has an incentive for better things to happen. So there are ways that the state will itself find. Those are responses that I'm going to give to this idea of research and development. Similarly, to the idea of, oh, well, consumers will no longer be able to go ahead and enjoy cheap discounts. I think on opposite, like on the other side, I will just argue that these cheap discounts means that competition is stalled because monopolization of markets means that you can do anything that you want. So if you look at the broader picture, both of these harms are something that can be minimized or mitigated to a large extent. You can have competition through other means, and if you want cheap goods, the downside of it is quality. But I don't think that both of those ideas can be proven symmetric. So in this instance, the most strategic way is to just engage with both those ideas and assume that you have to take both those trade-offs. That's the strategy that you should enter the room with. But oftentimes, you will find the other side not doing one of these things. A, they don't weigh a benefit. They won't just explain to you why deep discounts are so important to people. And if they don't do that, why should you trade that off? Because it's not something that's even explained to be of importance in the debate by the other side. Similarly, some sides won't just prove the argument. If they don't prove why people like these corporations can give you deep discounts, what is the use of trading that off? Why are you being so charitable? Of course, you should be charitable to the other side, but why should you buy an argument that has not been proven in the first place? So I think in those instances, you can sit, evaluate which argument has been proven, which argument has been contextualized and weighed, and then proceed to engage and buy a trade-off according to your own convenience as a team. That's the second way to look at it. But the more generalized way to look at it is to ask yourself, does this harm exist on both sides? If yes, give the reasons for why this is a symmetric idea. If this harm doesn't exist on both sides, but I can minimize the extent of this, minimize its extent, and then weigh against that, you are biting the trade off in the process. That's how I see that question. Do you have a follow up on that?
No, like it's clear.
Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, the next question. Okay.
Yeah, so my question actually stems a bit from Deepshika's question as well. So, quite often in the plot, we see cases that have very similar premises and very similar arguments being run on both sides. Therefore, trade offs become difficult to make, or like trade offs that are made are like negligible to begin with. So, how do we then propose a trade off that not only provides exclusivity to the case, but also like doesn't pose a huge harm to the case to begin with?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Oh, I think there's an example of a recent debate that I saw. Uh, I think the motion was something on the lines of this house believes a world, like this house would want to live in a world where God has overreaching power or God has a lot of power, whatever it is. And what the debate played out in the particular way the debate played out was very interesting. Gus said, yeah, you want to live in this world because minorities otherwise don't feel that there is a spiritual power who is listening to their prayers and who is setting all wrongs right. That's why you need a God who is almighty and all powerful. It's for the minorities. Opposition comes and tells me that's why you don't want God. Minorities think if for the last 100 years my ancestors have been treated this way, if there has been so much poverty, suffering upon this world, then God probably wills this. God probably wants this. And what can I, a minority who has very little power in the society, do against God's will? That's why we shouldn't want to live in a world where God has overreaching power. And both sides had the exact same responses to each other. Gov responded to opposition by saying that, oh, an almighty God gives individuals hope, and preserving that hope is the most important thing. And opposition has the exact same impact. Oh, because if God is so overreaching, then that would make individuals believe that they have no free will, that nothing that they do matters, so they will lose all hope. And this is one of the most confusing debates I've ever seen in my life. And I think that's what the question hints towards. I honestly think here the debate or the way that I adjudicate these debates is, I think the easiest way to adjudicate these debates is just to look at the world building that sides have given. What is the kind of world that we are living in? What is the kind of society that we have? So if the opposition in this debate could have come and told I've lost track of govern op. If one side in the debate could have come and told me that look, there are several reasons why people have self confidence that they can change things, and all they need is the added push of believing God is on their side. And if they do world building in that way, I think that side would win. And there are many ways to do world building in that way. I can just say capitalism has unlocked plenty of opportunities. Digitization has meant that resources are available at your doorstep. Role models and advertising has meant that everyone can create aspirational value around these things. Popular culture or media humanize these processes. All of this means that we live in a world where individuals have self belief. And that's why we want a world to be there where God is not overreaching so that individuals can act on their self belief. When the side characterizes to me that individuals actually believe or the self belief is something that's a construction of the world around them, their world building is much stronger. Their comparative is much clearer of why minorities are better because their self belief is now unchallenged and they believe their actions have consequences. Similarly, the other side can then win the debate on similar, like just like counter world building. So in a world where so or the other side just has to characterize why the world, or why oftentimes the way that minorities see the world is one where without an external or a third party actor, justice won't have been delivered. So, on the other side, what I would characterize is the importance of institutions like the state, the importance of institutions like the judiciary, the importance of institutions like the police, that there always has been a third party institution or third party actor which has balanced the scales. And this instance, it has to be God. And that's why, because society around us is shaped in this particular way, that's what people are programmed or hardwired to believe. And that's why we should have a powerful God who can go ahead and intervene and just do the tipping of the scales that is required for in many of these instances, just like the institution of judiciary does, just like the institution of a monetary body like the, I don't know, the central bank would do, just like the institution of a state does, and things like that. That's the easiest way I think these debates can be judged. What is the world building that both sides have? And if I want to group them into the technical aspects, I just think it's the framing and characterization that both sides give me. Because if you look at it, the impact is same. The impact is that of hope and all of that. And the weighing is more or less both sides are going to weigh, like in my debate at least, both sides weighed the exact same way. Both sides weighed scale, vulnerability, logical priority, certainty. And I was like, all of that symmetric. So the most clear way of debate, judging then this debate was then just framing and characterization. Framing is where is the debate happening? What world are we talking about? And characterization is just what is the actor that we are talking about. So I oftentimes default to setup or how the argument has been constructed, like the parts which pertain to like world building and framing in order to judge these debates. So that's the way that I see this.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool, cool. Are there any other questions? Cool. I assume that. Let's get to the building part of things. The first thing that you need to do is frame the debate. Because I have been in a debate room where my team argued 14 minutes of what we thought was absolute brilliance, and all it took was 20 seconds for the other team to make us a fourth in the round. And this is why framing is extremely, extremely crucial. I think the debate that I'm talking about was one where the debate motion was simple. Should corporations or workplaces have the ability to police your personal choices during work hours? The motion specifically said during work hours. And we ran a whole case on agency, why people deserve choice, why corporations are arbitrary constructs, why this is just a very small thing in the grand scheme of things. Heck, even religion is more important than my job, all of that. And the only thing the opposition had to do was say, Gov has great analysis. We agree. 10, 14 hours of your life or 15 hours of your life, live with that agency. We are going to debate about the 9 hours of that person's life, and we are going to tell you why those 9 hours you shouldn't go ahead and adhere to whatever Gov said, and our entire case was out of the room because that's actually true. And this is the problem with not noticing or not paying heed to framing. A very easy example of this is, I think, social justice movements. If I say, so if my social justice movement is Fridays for Future, which is a very niche idea, it's a Western concept that's been borrowed, and we do it in some major cities in India. I think it stopped happening. I'm not sure. I might be wrong on this. But the Fridays for Future concept was bunk school on Friday, come to a major attraction like Connaught Place in Delhi. That's where it happened in Delhi, at least, and protest there against your government. Sides will run that, oh, this brings government to the negotiating table. And in another debate about social justice movements, which might be about the farmers' protests, sides will run the very same impact. The obvious question is, how on earth can both debates be about the same impact? And the answer is, they're not about the same thing. And the problem is, The team assuming that Fridays for Future can actually bring the government to the negotiating table is completely bereft of the place that the debate is happening in. And that is what framing does. In a way, it is choosing your battlefield. What terrain do you want to make, like, fight the fight on? Where is the debate happening? If you don't make these things very, very clear, then there is very little significance that your impacts might often have. A very, like, maybe a better example of this is innovation and things like that. So, if my impact of innovation is, oh, people will have clean water and food supply being ensured, and if the debate is about developed countries, the other side is just going to come and say, food, water, and these bare minimum essentials are already ensured by a welfare state. The NHS literally gives free healthcare cover and things like that. What exactly are you adding to the debate then? And these are questions which completely change the frame of the debate, because then they will argue something that's far more important for a developed state. They might argue things like self actualization, jobs. They might argue things like political stability. They are going to argue everything except basic water supply and food supply, because a vast majority and an overwhelming number of people have this situation sorted or secured. This is the importance of framing. If you don't go ahead and frame things properly, then it's extremely difficult to win debates. And in most instances, in many instances, debates are often won or lost here. Uh, Framing, and this is what I also try to, or like what, like oftentimes try to see this as, is a commentary on the problem. It's like it's showing the people what the focus of the debate should be. And I think a very good way of, or a very like hands-on way of understanding this is, this house will, or this house believes that there should be specific LG, like schools, especially for queer children or the queer community, something on those lines. It's basically single sex schools, like Columbus, CJM, or whatever, but just for the queer community or things like that. So that's, if that's the motion. Gov is going to have a very simple argument. Gov is going to say, this is a kid, protect them from the worst harms of bullying. They have an identity which is not socially validated. Keep them safe. Opposition is going to say, you keep them safe for 5 hours a day. What about the rest 21? Like, sorry, bad at math. What about the rest 19? Like, what exactly are they going to do outside the bounds of the school, outside the walls of the school? How do you keep them safe then? Opposition's argument is going to be, no, because this is such a young age, they ought to learn faster, because the world growing up is a lot nastier, brutish, and worse. And that's why we shouldn't keep them in separate schools, or we shouldn't allow the existence of such schools. I think both sides can win. And it's just about what problem statements both sides pick. If Gov says that a vast majority of these kids have lifelong trauma, because like, which was induced at a very young age because of how unsure they felt about themselves, their own self, their sexuality, their own identity, because of how they felt that they understand so little of themselves, and how this, like, there was a lot of bullying around this, and why this has impaired your confidence for years and years. I think Gov points the problems to be significant. In many instances, this can look like, like inflicting self-harm to the, like, in many ways, like ranging from the most mildest forms to the worst ways and things like that. If that is Gov's problem identification, then Gov has a very strong idea of why these kids should be kept in a safe space. Because if opposition's idea is, oh no, they're going to turn adults one day and they need to learn to live life, Gov is just saying, yeah, we are doing things to ensure that they reach adulthood in a safe and a secure and a mentally stable way. And Gov's ideas automatically become more important because they identify the correct problem. It's about, it's about surviving those initial years. Similarly, opposition can also frame a problem statement. Opposition's problem statement in this debate can simply be about how these people have, or like how the queer community or queer kids growing up in these schools will have very limited ways in which they can now assimilate with people. Or if like lesser the interaction that the general public has with them, or the normative public, or what is like the traditional classification of the public has with them, the worse it is. Because the more alienated these two communities feel, the worse it's going to be for their assimilation and for them to feel relatable with each other. And opposition can just say that this results in lifelong harms of like assimilating, of finding jobs, of like I don't know, learning how to deal with these things later on and things like that. Of course, like opposition can also like, so in these instances when there are two competing frames, the obvious question then is, how do you then decide the winner? Because govs like pre-18 most important years, let them go ahead and build some kind of resistance to what is going to come ahead of them. Opposition is like pre-teen most important and more easiest way of building the like those self-defense mechanisms. Let them do it for the world ahead. I think in these instances, teams again then have to compare frames. Teams again then have to prove where exactly is the debate happening. I think a very easy way for opposition to do this is just to say, look, schools are anyways regulated. Almost all schools nowadays have counselors. Almost all schools have helplines that they can tend to, some designated guardian or designated teacher that they can go ahead and talk about their issues to. There is massive sensitization drives in schools. We are all digitally informed citizens by virtue of being born after 2000, 2001, 2002, and yada yada yada. So all of that proves that things won't be as bad in a normal or a mainstream school or a classic school. And that's why self-defense mechanisms then become the more important frame to debate in. So opposition has compared their frame in that way. But on Gov can just compare their frame by saying kids are stupid. Kids don't know anything. Kids below 16, the worst kind of people to exist, because they say anything, everything, laugh about it, bully you, don't feel one like strand of guilt and regret, and your life is ruined while they do whatever they want, just because of how emotionally mature kids are. And if that is their explanation of the world, then their framing becomes more important. I think there are n number of examples and n number of ways that we can discuss framings in the context of. But the most important thing to realize about framing is the identification of problem statement and knowing specifically if the debate applies there or not. And I think a very good way of remembering this is just read each and every word in the motion. Because we didn't read the word in our motion when my team debated in that round, like where employers should regulate behavior in work during work hours, we lost the entire round. Just because the motion said during work hours, all of our case becomes invalidated because that case is not meaningful in the vast majority of instances. In order for us to bounce back from that, we have to prove why your work hours are the most crucial hours. Maybe because you have the most interaction there, maybe because you attach the maximum value to your work, whatever it is. But we didn't do that. And neither did we have the chance to do that from opening up. And from one line of response, we are totally out with 70 speaker points. So if you don't frame well, it's very easy for smart teams to come and say, oh well, that's fine, but ABC, XYZ, and you're out. So that's the broad idea around framing, simply summarized in two sentences. It's where you decide the debate to be happening in, maybe developing world, developed world, maybe working class people, maybe bourgeois elite, maybe sports fanatics, maybe debate nerds, whatever it is. Where is the debate happening? What exactly does the debate concern itself? The second simple summarization of the framing idea is, what is the problem that I'm picking? What do I even want to choose? And things like that. And the most common examples of this, and I think there's a very famous example of this. I will link that at the end of the video. So there's a debate about should the feminist movement go ahead and in the times of war, should it rally for the military to do a certain, like, I don't know, do certain things and like other stuff. So the context is it's a time of war, and the motion is just the feminist movement should appeal to the military, I think, for conscription or something like that. All sides talk about harms and benefits, but there's a wonderful, wonderful speech which explains framing in the most clearest way possible. It just comes and says that the feminist movement, the military, and the war, it just explains these three aspects very clearly and shows where the debate is happening. It just proves the fact that during wartime, no one, and absolutely, military is the last institution which is going to pay any heed to any social justice movement. The military is the single most important source of defense during wartime, and it's definitely not going to pay heed to social justice movement during the most important times when they're needed and things like that. And that side just comes ahead and argues what the feminist movement can realistically do in such a period. And it just says that the debate is just about messaging, just about how feminist followers feel and things like that, and they cleanly win the debate. So I think these are some very famous instances of framing that can be really useful. And the way that I like to view framing is just how well do you identify the problem and how much sense does your case actually make. It's just that. It's identifying the problem statement is just that. It's gut checking whether the problem is something that's important to solve and whether the solution is feasible or not. So those are multiple ways in which you can look at framing, and that's precisely why framing is important. Characterization. So characterization and framing are often, in my experience, being used interchangeably. And I don't think there has to be a hard distinction between these kinds of terms because at the end of the day, they're just technical aids. But still, characterization, in its purest sense, is a bit different from framing. Framing discusses the world around us. What is the problem? What kind of a battlefield have you chosen for the debate? Or what kind of a setting does the debate operate in? Characterization talks about actors inside that debate. Characterization can be about two things. First, it can be a very biased view of status quo itself. If I ask my 45-year-old relative to explain India's current situation, my 45-year-old relative from Tamil Nadu is just going to say, we are massively secure because of massive defense spending that has happened in recent years. Economic development is at an all-time peak because of the bilateral relations our government has been able to establish. India is a rising superpower because of how important it is become in the Southeast Asian region to counter China's influence. Modi great, things like that. If I ask an average 18-year-old, digitally informed, conscious kid, looks at their surroundings, touches grass, what India is like, their answer is going to be, and of course, like it can be anything depending on where you fall on the political spectrum, but on average, universities are liberal spaces. So, an average liberal university goer in a hyper liberal space such as Delhi is going to say, uh, India has now become literal hell for minorities. The caste, like, and like there's been monopoly of violence that's been exercised through state institutions like the Enforcement Directorate, the CBI, and things like that. Anyone who dissents is put behind bars. Social liberties, civil liberties are at an all-time low, and things like that. This is characterization. It's just a biased view of status quo. And these two characterizations are useful in a debate which could just have been about this house regrets the Modi years. Gov could have characterized it in the second way. Op could have characterized it the way that my uncle would. And that's just essentially what characterization is, or at least the first aspect of characterization is. It's a biased view of how status quo operates. Of course, it's not to say that a college goer can't say that India is doing well. Of course, the college goer can say that. And of course, my uncle can also say that India is doing poorly because my uncle might be a human rights activist. But it's just on an average what that demographic might behave like. That's what I wanted to say. And that's this characterization. The second aspect of characterization is nature of actors. Nature of actors is derived out of the past knowledge of that actor, the incentives guiding that actor, the capacity that that actor has, and affiliations that the actor has. So, for example, if I am running and X person trips me, and you are asked to decide what would Sai's reaction be, it is almost impossible uh, telling what it might be, because we barely there's very little information that you guys have on me, or there is very little information that any stranger might have on me, because that's just common sense. But if I tell you that the knowledge, like if I give you any four of these things, if someone draws analysis and says Sai has deep religious upbringing, and that deep religious upbringing has forced him to see a world in a very empathetic way, and always forced him to give individuals a second chance. That shows what my incentives are, which is to give individuals a second chance. It shows what my affiliations are, which are deeply religious. It shows what my knowledge is, informed by these kinds of things. And it shows what my capacity is. I hold room for forgiveness. I'm not malice. I'm not malicious, sorry. That's explaining what the actor is like. But if someone comes and says that the last time this happened, Sai broke the person's nose, that person broke Sai's limbs, and all of them ended up in the hospital, then you are likely going to say that, oh, maybe the impact is that the impact is going to be bad, or the impact is something that's going to be unsavory or unreasonable, is going to shout or whatever. That impact was decided by you on the basis of knowledge, of like previous knowledge that the actor has of going to the hospital, of the capacity, how limited their temper like spectrum is, how what their incentives are. Maybe they believe in retribution and the fact that life is tough for everyone. There is nothing such as free lunch, so everyone should get what they deserve, and what everyone deserves is equal retribution for what they've done to others. And my affiliations might be violent, I might be a gangster, whatever it is. That gives you information that can certainly prove in what way I behave. Both of these are contrasting characterization of Sai as an actor. And you can do this for anything or anyone. You can do this for Sai. You can do this for DTU. You can do this for people belonging to Delhi. You can do this for Indians. You can do this for Hindus, Muslims, Christians. You can do this for the ASEAN bloc. Characterization can happen on any level. Actors exist on all levels. Family can be an actor that you talk about. State can be an actor that you talk about. SARC can be an actor that you talk about. The global south can be an actor that you talk about. The world and the human species can be an actor that you talk about. Or it's just parasitic small organisms can be an actor that you talk about. All of these are things that are actors, and you can specify these four ideas around actors, and you can reach whatever impact you want to, or do whatever you want. The last thing, then we'll just do a quick Q&A on this slide, is are things contentious or necessary? And this is not very important. The idea of this is just to prove why characterization is important. Characterization is important so that the debate is decluttered. If you don't tell me, if the entire debate is just about the way that Sai was stripped in, or Sai was made to fall in, or Sai was pushed, there is absolutely no way you can draw any reasonable impact. And the only way any reasonable impact gets drawn is if there is characterization of the actor. So that is what characterization does. It declutters the debate, and it helps judges give the side like verdict to one side or the other. That's why characterization is massively important. But the two components of characterization are: A, it's a biased view of status quo, biased view of reality that we live under. Secondly, it's a commentary on the nature of actors. What are the actors who are involved in this debate, and what are their knowledge, incentives, capacity, affiliations? And it's true for every debate. If it's IR, what is the like? What is how is Ukraine as an actor? How is Palestine as an actor? Inside Palestine, how is Hamas as an actor? How is the Palestine Liberation Organization as an actor? Inside Israel, how is the far right wing that's in power as an actor? How is the centrist left as an actor, and things like that. So all of these things are characterization of the nature, like characterization of the actors themselves. Questions on this slide?
I have one. So, yeah, about capacity and affiliations. Is capacity just about emotional capacity, or is it like capacity to act? And is affiliations about like religion or like political ideas, or is it more than that?
Oh, both these terms are universal. Any capacity, depending on what the debate is about, right? If the debate is about, maybe it's an IR debate, maybe Ukraine should launch a counter-offensive in like Bakhmut. It's a very strategic area, or some other area, like we that context, do they have the military troops outside? Will they have aerial cover because there's been a no-fly zone last? I don't know, that happened a long time ago, or whatever. Do they have maritime ways through which they can target the enemy? Is there capacity? Do they even have the ability to undertake the action? In that context, capacity means that. In some other action, capacity means something else. If the motion is this House believes that a truth and reconciliation committee should, not even this. I think there was a motion at last Australs. The motion was just about should South Korea and Japan deepen their trade relations. And OP just ran that people of South Korea have not yet forgiven Japan for what happened during its occupation years. The way that they treated their women, children, and the way that they treated prisoners of war, the way that they violated whatever basic humanity and decency that could be. That's why they don't have a capacity to engage in the first place. And if there's no capacity to engage, even if you deepen ties, there will still be a lot of hostility. Maybe the trade advantages won't be solidified. Things like maybe this will, like, I don't know, hurt South Korea's internal political dynamics or things like that. So maybe in that context, it means that. In an individual context, capacity can just mean, so maybe if the debate is just about, political parties, the capacity, maybe do political parties have the capacity to set aside these differences and come together? So it can be anything: mental, emotional, physical, material, depending on the debate. Similarly, affiliations, like it can be anything. Affiliation to a bigger organization, like India is affiliated to like ASEAN, also the UN, also the IMF, also the WTO, also the ICJ, and things like that. Or those can be affiliations as to India is also affiliated to the bloc of countries who have the shared collective trauma of being colonized. India also is also affiliated to the subcontinent, which has specific weather patterns that it follows and things like that. Both these terms are universal and open to interpretation. Any follow up on that? Fair, fair. Um, I saw someone else also raise their hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have one question. When in the debate in the very first place, there's a contention on characterization in the first place. In that case, how do you like frame your arguments better? For example, if there is a motion regarding what's in best interest of Bangladesh government side comes ahead and talks about as to how, in the very first place, Bangladesh government is democratic in nature. So in the end, for XYZ reason, they should go ahead and appease people because in the end they have to resort to these people for votes. But to this, OP comes ahead and say that Bangladesh in the very first place is not that democratic in spirit as it seems in structure, because in the first place, people, due to the kind of past they have of having tumultuous different structures of political governance, not exactly democracy, people in the first place do not aspire for the government to be democratic. Hence, appeasing these people for votes is not a characterization or thing that can stand whenever you talk about interest of Bangladeshi government. So, in such a clash of characterization, how do we make sure that we either rebut it, mitigate it, or still make our argument stand with such a framing in a debate?
Fair enough. I think in such a situation, I've also done a similar debate around these lines. So, from my experience, and what I would generally do is this: I, for a fact, know that democracy is not that big in Bangladesh. Awami League has been in power since time immemorial. Is the league which the founding father of the nation had, like, is the party which the founding father of the nation belonged to, and now his daughter runs it, and things like that. So maybe just this, right? Opposition is certainly going to have context specific analysis on why this is true, that they don't have the need for going ahead and being a democratic setup. Uh, I think on Gov, the reasons are going to be a bit weaker if they choose to run this argument that, oh, Gov, like Bangladesh is a democratic state. Because, A, on previous, like, so all states are democratic or undemocratic on the basis of the history that they've had. A reason why a lot of African dictators came up was because they were able to solidify power in the wake of colonialism. They were able to justify being in power for so long by saying that because of how deep the cut of colonialism is, we need to stay in power for so long so that we can stitch those wounds together and make a better Africa and things like that. So I think in such, like, where it's just knowledge based and it's not logic based, I think you can still resort to some general indicators, like, A, what is the backdrop that the country comes from? So an average reasonable voter knows that the liberation war happened in 71. What is a country that had to go through a war to be born and had to go through unspeakable horrors and violence in order to be liberated from its other part? What kind of a country it might be? And I think you can logically explain why such a country is oftentimes one where a single party is able to take and hold on to power for many years, because the conception is that, A, this person brought us freedom, so this person equal to great, but B, there needs to be stability, because if there is instability again, we might have a chance of backsliding to those same ways. And that's why we need a united or a unified front, and that's why people are very easily going to be in agreement with whatever happens. So maybe that's why there's an undemocratic setup and things like that. The second thing that I could argue is there is a overwhelming number of Muslims in Bangladesh, almost 98, 99%. So there is no question of a Christian or a Hindu, or like there's no AIMIM like there. There's no considerable Muslim opposition there. So at best, there can be a socialist front like in comparison to a like liberal party or things like that. But I think again, this somewhere this comes like, are there recent instances of violence against the state government which show that this government is hugely unpopular or this government is not hugely unpopular? If there are no instances of violence, we can assume that the state is doing good. And in fact, the ruling party does deeply care about its minorities. It's extremely socialist in its welfare policy. It deeply cares about refugees. It has set up exclusive refugee camps for those people coming from Myanmar and things like that. So I think general logic and some amount of spec is what you can rely to. Because in Gov, it's very difficult to come up with reasons why they might be democratic. Because A, countries around them are anyways not very democratic. So who is exporting democracy there? India, not the most democratic, but not the modern democracy that it should be. Pakistan, definitely not democratic. Never completed no PM has ever completed a tenure. Heavy military involvement. Afghanistan taken over by Taliban. China, like one party state. Who exactly? If like so, even logically, there are a lot of ways that you can argue on opposition why this can't be the way. Like this can't be like it can't be true that it's a democratic state, because oftentimes policy is influenced by what your neighbors are or what your neighbors do, because parties have an incentive to emulate whatever is happening around them. That's why we see a bunch of, like, I don't know, authoritative countries being geographically bunched together and things like that, because those are the countries that you share the deepest trade roots with. If India was super democratized and super liberal, we would just place like some kind of conditions, or we would often condemn countries whom we deeply trade with but have a poor human rights record as well. But because we often tend to do the same thing with our minorities, we are quiet or we don't mind those things. So like logically, I think you can build reasons better for opposition. So I think it's just asking these broad questions. If it's a state, okay, what kind of states surround it? What is the history of the genesis of the state? What is the identity of the state? Is there a predominant religion or is it secular or whatever it is? I think these guiding questions can help you assess which side's characterization is better. So that's the way that I see that question.
Yeah, just a single follow-up question. If there's a
Yeah,
contention
yeah.
on characterization, how do you then establish your characterization stands in the debate and theirs do not?
Better proof. So, like, that's what. If Gov cannot answer the question of why is this so, giving characterization is one thing, and proving characterization is the other. If I just say at PM, this debate happens in a liberal democracy and no one challenges it, then my characterization is bought without proof. But if there's a competing characterization, you need to tell me why your reasons are logically true or why you answer the question of why is it true. If government does not answer the question of why is it true, then your characterization automatically stands. You respond to the reasons that gov gives for its characterization. If gov has no reasons for its characterization, whereas you do, so your characterization is proven, whereas gov's characterization is asserted. Secondly, if you have responded to gov's characterization, but there is very little response from gov to your characterization, again, your characterization proves stands at a larger set of contexts. Because you have responded, gov's characterization stands in a lesser number of contexts. So those are ways in which you can compare characterization.
Yeah, that answers the question. Thank you.
Fair enough, fair enough. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I have a question. Could you
Okay.
just explain what's contentious or necessary to declutter? Like, I'm not able to understand that some point. If you could explain that once.
Oh, so maybe so it was like it meant to serve two purposes. One was just to say that characterization helps declutter the debate. And the second thing that I wanted to convey through this point was characterization can be contentious. I think let's look at this slide and let's look at weighing. Like, sorry for skipping a step, but I just think that maybe like the question that was just asked before the one that you like recently, like, so both of them are connected in my head at least. So, in an instance where both sides' characterization is true, because sure, Bangladesh op can prove that Bangladesh is not democratic, but Gov can prove some other characterization, I think. Gov can prove the characterization that Bangladesh is an export heavy economy and that textile business is one of the most renowned in the world. But it's also true because of how tiny Bangladesh is. And if you're that tiny and if you're that young as a nation state, then you are obviously relying a lot on imports as well. So like it's something like if your exports go away, you no longer have foreign exchange reserves to buy those imports which you overwhelmingly need. Because so your main way of surviving can be those exports, but if you don't have those exports, then you are generally reliant on the goodwill of nation states and things like that. So Gov's characterization can just be that Bangladesh's economy is very weak because it just relies on export of textile and nothing else. So that can be a characterization which is proven on Gov. And the characterization on op can be something very different. That this is not a democratic state itself. How do you then weigh between these two characterizations? I think that would be a better uh, like uh, more representative question which encompasses both the doubts. I think a couple of things. Firstly, and this is why I've written contentious or necessary declutter. I just copy pasted it because I wanted to call back to the characterization aspect of things. If there is a characterization clash, it can either be perfectly on clash, as the question was. In that instance, better reasoning wins, better engagement wins. But what if the characterization is parallel? What if the characterization, Gov's characterization talks about ABC, but opposition is talking about PQR? How do you make these two things interact? I think that there are some ways in which you can weigh those ideas. And I think the question is answered through a brief overview of weighing. There are two broad ways in which you weigh things. One is independent weighing. and the other is comparative weighing. If you just say that my characterization makes the impact stand for a larger scale of people, and your characterization is hyper specific about trade, and it's hyper specific about one import that we might be unable to afford. Sure, oil is a very important and necessary import, but it's lesser in scale and pertains to lesser number of stakeholders, because maybe there are some other ways that we can get oil as Bangladesh. Then the opposition's characterization is more important just on scale. If opposition's characterization just deals with a more vulnerable stakeholder, if opposition's characterize of, oh, Bangladesh is not a democratic state, and that's why it treats its minorities in a very bad way, and government's idea is that, oh, but we will lose oil. Opposition can just say that we deal with a more vulnerable actor, and this is a harm that happens in the immediacy versus the harm of running out of oil and electricity, which might happen in the next 12 months or in the long run. So that's another way that you can compare things: vulnerability, short run, long run. The third kind of weighing can be reversible, irreversible. Is a specific harm reversible, or is a specific harm irreversible? The fourth can be just certainty and uncertainty. So depending on what happens as a consequence of that characterization, you can argue one characterization to be more important than the other. This is only true in instances where characterization is vaguely off clash. In most instances, characterization is competing, and that is why you either win on engagement of characterization or you win on better reasoning. But in the instance that characterization is just off, that like it's just off, and both teams refuse to engage, then you can have independent weighing. Like you can also have comparative weighing, but I think we can come to it after impacting. It's just I see it more structured in my brain that way. Does that answer the question?
Yep, it does.
Fair enough. Like declutter or I just wanted to convey a couple of things with that. A, always be on the lookout for contentious or necessary characterization. And declutter, it's just that avoid characterization that everyone will automatically agree on, and avoid characterization, avoid basing your arguments without characterization. So like that's what more or less because, oh yeah, this is also something that happens. People characterize for 7 minutes and the other side just has to agree. If in a debate about religion, you just argue for 7 minutes that people are selfish on Gov or on PM, I think it's very difficult to dispute that people are selfish. 99% of people are selfish, and even in the instances where empathy exists, it's often as a consequence of a selfish incentive to feel gratification, or if it's often as an incentive, like selfish incentive of feeling reciprocity. So human beings are selfish at the end of the day. So there is no point in proving that human beings are selfish for 7 minutes. What there is a point in proving is human beings are selfish. As a consequence, they discriminate against other people. So I think that's also a very important part of characterization, because in many instances, sides just say, oh, we need to characterize what this actor is like. No, you need to characterize only what is important for your argument to stand. If both sides will agree that selfishness is something that's agreed upon, every human being is selfish. Okay, so what? I think you don't spend much time on it and you spend time on other things. So I think like contentious characterization is just something that's competing, something that someone disagrees on, and you need to prove through responses or reasoning. Necessary characterization is something that just can't be agreed to and moved on from. Necessary is one that stands and has to be responded to, and that's like largely what helps make it easy for debates to be judged. Cool. Impacting, I think um, impacting is just like self-explanatory. It's just what happens as a consequence of this. So what? I am selfish. So what? What? Like, how does this? How does proving this premise matter to anyone in the debate? Because selfishness also means that I don't share a toffee with my partner, but it also means that I am a very toxic partner in a relationship. Selfishness can mean both things, and both those impacts are significantly different. Stealing a toffee from someone is not a harm at all. But like being a toxic partner and being selfish in that dynamic is something that's a significant harm, because you make the other person's life hell and things like that. So impacting is just about making your arguments relevant, or proving what happens as a consequence of that idea. Because many a times people just say access. Sure, more kids get access to education, but what do they do after that? What is the impact on their lives? The impact is that they're able to make their lives better. They're able to access more opportunities of jobs and things like that. So the first thing is impacting is just the stakeholders. How do things around us change? Or this is what like you often do when you see emotion. Whom does this debate affect? Who are the stakeholders that this debate ends up affecting? What kind of an institution, state, person, actor does this debate end up affecting? And this is often what you do with like any motion. So if there's a motion about religion, the people affected are A, the majority, the people who subscribe to that religion. The people affected are B, the minority, people who don't subscribe to that religion. The minority can look like two things: A, people who subscribe to competing religions, or people who subscribe to no religions. The majority can be described on a specific, like a spectrum. A, fundamentalists who believe everything that theology has ever said. B, liberal people who have a religion because it gives them an anchor in life and it gives them hope. And I think like those are two actors explained in like two different like ways, like so two actors and both specified or clarified in two different ways. The third set of stakeholders it can affect is priests, the gentry of that religion itself, imams, like pujaris, all of that. The fourth kind of stakeholder can be politics, because religion often has a huge hold over politics and other competing institutions in the world. The fifth kind of stakeholder can be the environment, because there is massive environmental harm that happens as a consequence of many religions, burning in many religions, wastage of milk in very like offering of milk in many religions, sacrifices in many religions, animal sacrifices, like whatever it is, like all these kinds of things. Stakeholders is just seeing if an entity is affected by emotion or not. uh, the second idea of impacting is to assess how is the stakeholder impacted. And this is where the idea of importance comes in. If you so this is very relevant in BPs, right? Because in many BP debates, opening half takes up the most obvious ideas. So the most common way for closing students as debates just becomes impacting. How does impacting exist on a spectrum? I think there are various impacts that people can draw of climate change. If my idea is climate change is happening and we want to stop that climate change, that's the argument from Gov. Maybe the motion is we will shift to green technology, and Gov's idea is climate change will stop. But why is it important to stop climate change is something that's never answered unless you impact your idea. And this ties back to the second question of any argument, which is why is it important? Oftentimes, the way that you answer why is it important is by answering what the impact of this argument is. The impact of arguments is to stakeholders that's specifically affected. And it's important to note the impact that you specifically choose in most instances. Sometimes you might choose like impacts which are negligible, like stealing a toffee. It almost has very little value. And in many more instances, you might choose the most accurate impact, which is like, oh, not stealing a toffee. In the context of climate change, it can be. So if once someone's impact is that floods wash away the homes of millions of civilians, and if someone's impact is, oh, now there is lesser leisurely time, I cannot spend time shopping because majority of the time people have a threat of heat wave. Sure, the threat of heat wave is real, but the heat wave causing crops to wither and substantial commercial loss and food loss is far more like egregious and an important harm than people losing the time to shop and things like that. So impacting is extremely important. And examples or illustrations. Saying that, so if I just say that I am happy or my life has been saved versus me saying, so like if your impact is saving lives or your impact is securing someone or securing their happiness or preventing torture or whatever it is, versus saying that we don't allow those individuals to starve to their death, to be affected by disease, which slowly eats away at your body in like and just makes you act in ways that are extremely bad, which you often do out of desperation for food and things like that. Or maybe if you just like, so that's one way of explaining an impact. Impact explanation just is an understanding or is an illustration of what exactly happens on the ground. And I think examples or illustrations are very good here. Just saying that, oh, the economy is now better. What does it mean for the economy to be better? Are there more notes in circulation? Or are people like magically happier? Like what happens? If you say that the economy is better, now people have goods which are available at a cheaper price. That means more amount of money can be spent on aspiring like fulfilling lifetime aspirations that they had, maybe building a house, maybe securing that education for their child which they always wanted, maybe going on that trip that they always aspired to. So people on a net are happier by virtue of more savings. That's a very realistic and a very tangible impact of people feeling happy and people being better off in an economy or like in an economic benefit or things like that. So that's the entire idea about like around impacting. Quickly then on weighing. I think I've already explained what independent weighing means. Comparative weighing is thing that we need to look at and is oftentimes more important. I think comparative weighing is just assessing what is more important, like what is more important in both impacts. Because many a times, both impacts can be important on in a vulnerable instance. If it's a debate about a post-colonial period where the state is in like in shad like it's in very bad conditions and there is no food for anyone, there is no concept of vulnerability because even the majoritarian Hindu is suffering. So how do you weigh these things in a debate? How do you exactly go ahead and delineate or differentiate these aspects? In those instances, comparative weighing is something that becomes more handy. What is comparative weighing? One example of comparative weighing is what is more proximate to an individual. So a classic example of this is the money versus freedom debate. I think that in this debate, it's easy to prove that life or freedom is more proximate to us, or rather, it's easy to prove that it's logically prior. If there is no freedom, there is no use of material benefits. You don't determine in what ways the material benefit affecting you. If there's money, billions of dollars lying around, but you still have a very strict diet you need to follow, there's still foundations on your personal and private life. There's still a huge laundry list of things that you're denied from doing. Then what is the value of that money? Is the limited instances in which that money becomes useful of any utility to you if your most favorite things are locked out of the fact that you're almost in a slavery like situation. That's an instance where it's logically prior for freedom to be there in order for material benefits to make sense. In another situation, you can argue the opposite. It's like upliftment of the poor in society. Money becomes logically prior because the way that we assign social status in a society like India or any other society is how much backing or how much economic capacity they have. If they have economic capacity, they can employ people under them. If they have economic capacity, they don't have to do things that are dehumanizing and undignified or which like just strip you of your dignity and things like that. If you have economic capacity, you live in a neighborhood where everyone aspires to live in. This automatically builds your respect in society, and that respect allows you a vast amounts of freedoms and things like that. And in this instance, money is logically prior to those kinds of freedoms or that kind of agency. Money builds agency in a way. So these are some examples where you can prove logic priority of arguments. One thing leads to the other. A very famous, like a very good example of this is also like short term or long term. If I say a post colonial state should prioritize agriculture and food security, or should a post colonial state prioritize manufacturing and industry development? A very common argument both sides are going to say is once you have food, in the long run, you can secure industry because you have a healthy working class and a working labor who is willing to put effort and bring prosperity to the country. An opposition can just say Once you have the massive infrastructure to import massive massive, like, I don't know, industries, capital, foreign infrastructure, you can have better food quality, and that can mean better impacts for the children, for the women, for the men of the society, and things like that. So logical priority, this leads to the other impact, that impact, or like the other impact leads to this impact. It's a very common way of comparative weighing, even proximate, right? If money is less proximate to me because it means nothing without agency, then that's a far off harm. But this, like, there's also other instances of weighing proximity, right? Right now, if there's an electricity blackout in Delhi versus right now, if there's an electricity blackout in Gaza, what is more proximate to you? On, like, in principle, the electricity blackout in Gaza is worse because it's being done in order to bomb their homes. It's a part of a systematic oppression that a settler colonial state has imposed on them. And our blackout can just be a blackout. It can even be Earth hour for, like, all that I know. It can be anything. It can be an electricity trip. So in theory, what is more important is the electricity blackout in Gaza. But what is going to hurt us is an electricity blackout here. An electricity blackout means the session gets over. An electricity blackout means my sibling who's playing Call of Duty, now their game gets shut and they're really annoyed. Electricity blackout means my parents who are working right now, they get really annoyed because they can't make their calls and things like that. So on proximity, this harm is bigger to us, even if in principle or in theory, the harm of a blackout in Gaza is much, much more. And similarly, like centrality to end goal, what helps achieve the end goal better? Like, if it's the motion is about where are the, like where are underprivileged and disadvantaged children better able to access social mobility, is it in an instance where a college opens its doors to more people, giving more opportunities, or is it in an instance where it gives quality opportunities? Is the starting point more important, or is the process itself more important? That's weighing with respect to the end goal itself. So, and contentious or necessary, like, it just applies to the same thing as before. If the weighing is necessary, only then do it. On both sides, if you affect a million billion people, it doesn't matter if you affect billion and 1,000 more. It's like comparable numbers. Like, it's 1.1 billion versus 1 billion. It makes no difference. Similarly, vulnerability. One population is dying of hunger. The other population is dying of war. The other population is dying of oppressive regimes. Everyone is vulnerable. How do you compare suffering in this way? So try to do as much as of comparative, like, weighing, because independent weighing many a times is just symmetric. Everyone, like, a lot of impacts can exist on scale. A lot of groups can be vulnerable and things like that. The last thing is just even ifs, right? And this is more of an idea of responding. And even if it's like, the concept is simple. Even if the other side has not proven their best iteration of that argument, you take that argument and say, this is still, like, despite this being true, this is why we win. So in that argument about, like, expanding seats versus limiting the number of seats, even if there are limited number of seats on opposition's side, even if the quality or the process of that education is more important, like, it's just like complete, or even if that's completely proven, and the most important thing in the debate, we tell you a couple of things. A, maybe it's a lot difficult for individuals to understand the starting point of social mobility. Or B, maybe that brand value of having a college education in the first place is what becomes the tipping point for unlocking a vast majority of benefits for a lot of people. Because they can just argue that without a collegiate degree, no one values you in the market and things like that. So maybe more than the process itself, it's the brand value that people want to enter for. It's the social validation and social approval of a college degree that people want to enter for. That's argumentation defeating their best case. Similarly, from the other side, you can have argumentation defeating Duff's best case. Any questions on this slide? Yeah, sure.
I wanted to ask about the centrality of end goal. I didn't understand that point.
Oh, so where do you reach the end goal better? Uh, so if the end goal is social mobility and giving people a chance to improve their lives, especially first generation learners and things like that. Yeah, especially first generation learners and things like that.
The centrality bit just becomes
to do or achieve that end goal. I just meant what is a better way to achieve the same end goal.
someone's calling. Just give me a second. Yeah. Centrality to end goal just means that where is that end goal achieved better? Uh, Gov can just say that, oh, for a first generation learner, social mobility is achieved better when they get admission into an institution which is socially approved and they have the starting point to make their life count. Without a degree, mass majority of society doesn't even look at your resume and thinks you're unqualified unless you're a brilliant genius and things like that. So they achieve the end goal. Like in this instance, they can prove that access achieves the end goal better. Similarly, opposition can just say that, oh, we live in a digitized world where Coursera, Udemy, Duolingo, everything exists. So starting points are plenty. And there are several instances or in stories of dropouts. Elon Musk is a dropout, and a lot of other successful people are dropouts. So society is not like this anymore. What matters is, do you have quality sources? And then opposition can prove that quality sources are more important for a first generation learner to beat the massive competition that they're up against. And that proves the end goal better, that this person lives a better life. So that's what I meant by centrality to end goal.
Yeah. So I have another question.
Yep, yep.
In that question, an example of like proximity versus principle or moral obligation in Graza blackout and like Delhi blackout. If in this case they're able to somehow prove by mechanization as to how even in this case proximity is something that should not be taken care of, and morality and that principal argument of maybe on the lines of cosmopolitanism or activism or people showing empathy for these people, do they still proximity presides over this principality, or then principality ends up taking it over proximity?
Yeah, I think principality can take over proximity. So you can disprove the weighing metric and say that this is the incorrect weighing metric in the debate. So if the debate is this house as Sai would prefer a blackout in Delhi in comparison to Gaza, of course, proximity is easier to weigh and it's harder to dispute because the actor is me. But if the motion is this house believes that Indian, like, of course, this won't be a motion, but this house believes that India should want a blackout in Delhi rather than a blackout in Gaza, you can just say that India is a composition of a million, like billion of empathetic citizens. And like principality should win because every nation state should do whatever is possible in its capacity to support another nation state. So if the trade-off is between these two blackouts, we'll be willing to absorb that harm, even if it's more proximate, because we stand for a bigger principle. And this is how nation states are able to like sustain and construct themselves, or whatever principle reasoning that you want to give. So yeah, of course, if you can displace a metric and prove another, like it's just about displacing metrics, and that can depend on the motion wording and from motion to motion. So of course, principality can beat proximity in this instance. I just weighed it that way because it seemed like the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, understood.
Cool. Um, Lastly, then I'll just do this very quickly because this is just more about what happens in round, right? Uh, I think this is just, if you want to rename this slide, I think this slide can be renamed to common mistakes that happen during a round. And these are the common mistakes that like seen throughout my journey. The first is comparative. Sides just don't prove the comparative, right? And in vast majority of instances, you'll be surprised. Like there was a debate recently, so if the motion was, this house believes that West states should disincentivize the students from pursuing education abroad or in Western universities. If a side runs racism in Western countries, then that's uncomparative. Because have you seen the racism that happens in India itself? the racism between different like language speaking communities, the racism like casteism, deeply embedded like social discrimination, the economic discrimination, the social premium that's like placed on English fluency and things like that. So there are so many instances where people don't question the comparative. The thing that you should again and again and again, and the more the debate progresses from PM to DPM to GovWeb, you should ask yourself is, okay, this is what happens on their side, but what happens on my side? If, okay, this is what happens on my side, but what exactly happens on their side? I think this is one of the most common mistakes that I've seen. The second is just the order in which people or judges by metrics. The first is explicitly agreed. If everyone in this call agrees that money is more important than life, then that becomes the metric. Doesn't matter if that's not the debate. The judges ought to judge the debate on the basis of what's agreed in the debate and what's not agreed. Similarly, the second thing that's argued like or important is what is implicitly agreed upon. So if one side says money is more important to have a better quality of life, and the other side says freedom is the way to have a better quality of life, the implicitly agreed metric is quality of life. Sure, it is not as specific as money being explicitly agreed upon, but it's still a metric that can be evaluated by the judge. And implicit like agreements are often as a consequence broader. The third is just sides which better analyze. If both sides have not explicitly agreed, and both sides are not willing to implicitly agree even by being off clash or whatever it is. So the most common thing that happens is that sides just like go ahead and like judges just like default to what is the most analyzed idea then in the debate, or the metric in the debate. The last thing is then what does the average reasonable voter buy? If there's no explicit agreement, if there's no implicit agreement, and no metric is analyzed well, it's just what is the average reasonable voter more willing to buy? What is a more intuitive thing? And things like that. So if one side's metric is money, but the other side's metric is, oh, maybe this person now has better capacity to uh, make shopping decisions for themselves or make monetary decisions for themselves, then it's unclear why monetary decisions for a specific person are more important than money that could be used to raise overall quality of life. As an average reasonable voter, I'll of course say that money for overall quality of life is more important. The third thing often is comparative refutation. I think, again, this ties just back to the first idea, right? Sides don't refute comparatively. Racism happens on if a gov comes and says, oh, racism happens. The most effective refutation is just to say racism happens on both sides. Casteism is just as worse as an English speaking man looking down upon you and things like that. That is what comparative refutation is. This happens on both sides. What teams often tend to do is, oh, racism doesn't happen because the places that people go to have a lot of immigrant population. Oh, the colleges that we are going to study in, like Stanford, they are extremely liberal and they have safe community, safe spaces that children can enroll themselves in. Sure, that's quality refutation. I'm not denying, but that's not comparative. It never explains why that harm can't like exist on both sides. And comparative refutation does a lot more harm than independent refutation, because independent refutation at best can say that, oh, the harm is not as big. Okay, sure, safe spaces exist. Okay, sure, this is a melting pot of immigrants. But in some patches or like figments of reality, you will still feel racism. On the other side, if you prove that those sources of racism are symmetric and the sources of racism inside the country are maybe far worse off, then that just comparatively beats the argument. Whenever you comparatively refute, you are more effectively refuting. I'm not saying that each and everything can be comparatively refuted. I'm just saying that instances where it can happen, it should happen. The second thing is, and I think this is the most self-explanatory thing, just be charitable. Don't strawman. If the other side has an impact, make an honest assessment of that impact. I think that's clear. But I think like the more important thing are the next two things. A, assumptions. Is the impact making a reasonable assumption or not? A very common example of this is humans are rational. So if the impact is, oh, of course, that person is going to choose their own safety over giving up everything for ideology, You just have to challenge the assumption from the other side that humans default to the social construct of rationality, but that's untrue. Everyone has a specific define of their own rationality, like or defined version of their own rationality, and humans are irrational. The rational thing is to rush to safety. Humans might want to rush to their death because they feel more pride in doing that, and that's a completely irrational decision. And that irrational decision might be a consequence of like whatever things that might have happened to them. So basically, characterization of the actor and why that irrationality might be a consequence of that. So these assumptions are something that you should call out, but also be honest when listing them yourselves. The last thing is shielding against easy responses. So this is again like if one side says that look, there are many ways to achieve social cohesion, and if the debate is about affordable housing, Gov is of course going to say that one of the many benefits of affordable housing, in addition to the fact that you house more people, is supporting affordable housing means you support mixed communities, mixed socio-economic communities. So you have more social cohesion. But the easy response is just that, okay, don't people will not talk to their neighbors, as simple as that. People won't like the kind of schools might still be different. Even if the schools are different, there might be social discrimination inside classrooms. You might judge people on the basis of what they wear to school. Or even if uniform is there, you might judge the other person on the basis of what they eat. The person on the basis of what like how they speak, what is their dialect, like how fluent they are in English, things like that. So the third thing in being charitable is just shielding yourself against easy responses. So if a debate exists about affordable housing, the best argument is just to make less people are homeless. If you choose to like make an argument, and this can be an argument that social cohesion occurs, the most easy response to you is, why is this the best form of social cohesion? Why does it even work? So just shield yourself against these responses if you decide to run something charitable. This is more with respect to BP, because in open, like if you're opening half, you have absolutely no control over what closing says, what closing does. But in Asians, this is less of a problem. So I think like this is not as necessary for an Asian workshop. The last thing is just impacts and weighing. If you do, even if you automatically tell the judge a path to victory. If your case stands against the other side's best case, that is an independent reason why you should win, regardless of anything else that has happened in the debate. Even if the other part of the debate is the most significant thing, like most significant thing of the round, or even if the other parts of the debate are not significant at all, regardless of that, if you analyze even ifs, if you tell me why your case stands, even if the opposition's best claim is true, or their opposition's claim is true to the best possible degree, this is why we win. I think this is what like makes it very easy for cases to stand. And this is also a very integral part of completion. And this is also a very common mistake that happens. If you don't do an even if, it's judges comparing two cases. They might have varying level of responses to each other. Both sides might have varying level of argue like reasoning to prove arguments. But the problem is you rely on the judge's acumen and you rely on the judge's judging ability. And judges are not perfect human beings. Judges have different subjective thresholds of what is good and what is bad, what is intuitive and what is not intuitive. If I have come from a family where there is not many affections or like public affections of love, and if someone is making an argument about how public affections of love are so effective and things like that, I'm not going to buy that like as a judge, because I'll be like, where does this even happen? Or like my intuitive threshold is too high for that. Similarly, the converse, if I am from a very religious background and you just say hope, I will automatically create the links in my like brain. Sure, that's bad judging on my part. But the idea is that there are different judges in the circuit that we debate in, and no one is perfect. Everyone has different backgrounds. Everyone is differently religious. Everyone has differently like different political opinions, schools of thoughts that they subscribe to. The most cleanest thing that everyone can then agree upon is even ifs. Because in even ifs, you take the best instance of the other side's case and you weigh against that. And that becomes a very easy thing for every kind of judge to see whether they're religious or not, whether they're a capitalist or a commie, whether they, I don't know, believe in XYZ or ABC, whatever it is. So it's to secure as many judges as possible. It's just something that's very strategic to do, considering that judges are human beings at the end of the day. Any questions on this slide? Yep, yep.
Can you once explain the explicit and implicit agreement in the metric segment?
Oh, fair enough. So explicit agreement. So implicit agreement. Like let's start with implicit. If it's a debate about quality of education is more important versus access to education is more important, I think that both sides are going to argue. So of course these are parallel metrics. These mean two different things altogether. Quality versus quantity, like these are very two different things. But I think the end goal that both of them are trying to reach is the same. In one instance, of course, it's not same in all instances. If both sides talk about minorities, then their end goal is more or less similar. Because Gav is going to say the biggest beneficiary of these are socioeconomic minorities. And opposition is going to say that, oh, well, the degree or quality of education for the socioeconomic minorities is worse off, or whatever it is. So in this instance, it becomes an implicit agreement as to what does the most good for a disadvantaged person's life. Another way of looking at in like implicit agreements is, or implicit end goals is, the criminal justice system. If one side argues that the criminal justice system is rehabilitative in nature, and the other side argues that the criminal justice system is retributive in nature, then it's very difficult to distinguish or delineate between these two metrics. So your implicit assumption just becomes, or your implicit clash just becomes, what should the criminal justice system follow? Contrast this with a debate around an agreed metric. If both sides agree that retribution is the most important thing in the debate, one side agrees, one side says retribution is achieved if you, I don't know, like if it's a debate about public punishments, like it happens in Saudi Arabia and things like that. If the debate is supporting that, Gov will say, yeah, retribution is better served because everyone sees it viscerally. Opposition might say, no, retribution might be better achieved, or like there might be a public showing of what this person like has done. But a, either it might not be like, it might be overdoing it, or b, it might go ahead and create a cycle of instances where the person feels deep degree of dehumanization, and hence the person feels that the person never just gets rehabilitated and all of that. So in this instance, the clash just becomes whether retribution as a metric is effective or not, because both sides contention is whether this is effective or not. Gav is saying this will teach them a lesson, but opposition says no, this will burn them with seething anger. So I think that's the like broad like difference in both cases. In the second, like in the first like instance, sorry, teams never explicitly say this is the end goal that both of us commonly aspire to reach. You make that link, and that link is acceptable to make, because notice how little the like how like easily and how intuitive it is to go from, oh, one side arguing rehabilitation, other side arguing retribution. So both teams want to argue what should the CJS follow. This is a very safe assumption to make. So you're not being interventionist in the debate. Similarly, if one side says quantity versus other side says quality, it's very easy to understand that what is best for children is what the clash is about. That's the implicit link that you're making. And these implicit links are very safe to make. Versus a very direct clash. One side says retribution or public punishment is good because it makes them understand what they've done. It finally like knocks some sense into them. And the other side says no, this is dehumanizing, undignified, and this burns them with seething anger. So like both sides are completely on clash, and both sides just want to prove one thing, thing, the efficacy of retribution. Is this effective or is this not? So that's the like difference between both sides explicitly saying that they agree on this and both sides implicitly agreeing on something.
All right, understood.
Yeah, I
Any
just
other
have a
questions? Yeah.
yeah, I just have a question regarding the be charitable point. In debate,
Mhm.
sometimes in that competitive heat of the moment, how do you go ahead and be a little objective about what arguments are actually charitable or incharitable and which ones are not? Because sometimes just because you as a side think that this is something you cannot rebut or this is an argument which you might not have a rebuttal to, you might end up feeling okay, this is maybe an uncharitable burden being pushed on us because we necessarily can't think of an effective rebuttal. So how be a little more objective in identifying whether actually an argument or claim is charitable or not?
Um, okay. So a couple of things. A, the fail safe is even if. So regardless of whether you are checking your biases or not, if it's standard for you to have even if as a part of your game plan or strategy, you will automatically end up being charitable because even if forces you to include their best version. But this is the ideal scenario. Now for a more realistic scenario, a couple of things. A, often your intuition is correct. Trust your intuition. The judge also operates by the same intuition because of how similar like intuition of how similar intuitive things are to everyone. So if the other side is making some absolutely uncharitable ideas, the judge is bound to call those things out, and the judge can clearly see that the proof doesn't exist for these kinds of things. But in the instance that you don't want to rely on the judge, I think that it's just easier to fall back to the idea of even if. I think the more important part of your question is how many things can we be charitable to? Because it's just 7 minutes at the end of the day, right? If there are five claims that the other side makes, it's rather it's like very difficult to be charitable to so many things. I think there, even in the heat of the moment, I think for three people together, you can come to a consensus of what the biggest pushes are. So employ the even if strategy against those two, three big pushes. So because if those are the two, three, like, and there are easy ways of determining this. What does the opposition spend the maximum amount of time on? Like if they've been repeating the same idea, reiterating it or analyzing it down the bench, that becomes automatically their biggest push. Secondly, where do you see the maximum change? If you see the maximum amount of life saved or money saved or whatever, a huge impact, then that automatically becomes their most important idea. So you don't have to use the even if on all things because I know that it's not just humanly possible, but also in the heat of the moment, it might just like not happen. But I think you can force yourself to use the even if for their biggest push or for their two biggest pushes. So I think even in the heat of the movement, if this is a strategy that you enter the debate with, and this becomes a section of your speech in the second and the third speeches, because the first speeches like can't like they just don't know what the other side is going to say. So I think then in the heat of the moment, maybe this is something that can help do this to a certain degree.
Yeah, okay. So we go ahead and take the best case scenario and then end up proving even in that case how we are better off.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And you can do this for the biggest or the second big two biggest arguments, and the easy indicator of that is what have they pushed for the maximum amount of time and what seems intuitively the largest thing. So maybe those two things. Yeah. uh,
Yeah, yeah, understood.
any other questions? Cool. This isn't as important. We'll just like quickly run through it. It's like the moral is the session is over only. All the relevant bits have been covered. Because there is nothing else to argument and case construction. There's just me giving unwarranted and unsolicited advice. It's a picking what to run. Like, so just run easy stuff, right? Like often the things which are easiest to run are true. They are easy to run because they are true and not the other way around. Like it's so intuitive because it actually happens. Your intuition is not misinformed. Trust your intuition, run easy stuff. Like I after 2 years of debating, I found out this argument and I was like, wow, this house will legalize drugs. Or not legalize drugs, like legalize marijuana, or this house will ban tobacco. I think that's a better example. This house will ban tobacco or ban cigarettes. A very easy gov argument is just to say there exist hundreds and thousands of tobacco farmers. If you tell them to shift, they can't. The soil has been, like, there's a specific amount, like there's specific fertilizers used for specific crops. The pattern is something that the soil can't adapt to. It's difficult for different inputs to be bought at such a short notice, all of that. A lot of farmers get affected. And that's like, out of all the arguments that you can give for not banning cigarettes, like choice, like so many big arguments, one of the easiest things to just say is like job loss. And this argument actually works in a BP debate where, like, of course sides are like, like sides don't have much to run. So pick things which are easy to weigh and pick, like, in unintuitive stuff. Just know that if your intuition points you towards something, it's probably because your intuition is right. Trust your intuition more than doubting it. It goes a long way in this sport. The second way is just meta commentary. I think it's just how you structure speeches. So oftentimes you will receive feedback, oh, I didn't know where this was headed. You can fix that by this simple idea, meta commentary. The conclusion of the argument that I gave you is this. That's it. That's meta commentary in every speech. You can do that for every speech. In BP debates, when there are 8 speeches, you do a review of the round as well. You say, this is what has happened so far in the round. This is how we insert ourselves. OG said money good. O said money bad. CG said money good or bad. Money more is a net good. We say money more is a net bad, or whatever it is. Like, just summarizing what is it that has happened in the round exactly. And thirdly, just recognize multifaceted material. It just means material can be constructive and destructive at the same time. Like, the argument can construct and respond at the same time. If your argument is build defense like apparatus in India, that can be constructive and responsive at the same time. Maybe if the other side says don't build it, it's constructive because maybe you can, like, just list down the benefits. But it also, like, deconstructs a lot of what other side has to say, because during the construction of defense is important, you automatically end up proving that it's one of the very important things. So if you just recognize that your material does both those things, you avoid repetition, because all you have to do after an argument is just to say this constructs as well as rebuts. So that's broad idea that this, like, slide had. And these are just important notes. There are tons of online workshops